first I'll sort of like contextualize a little bit. So there's different languages that people use to describe like development. Um, and before I was talking about process theories and I was talking about like developmental psychology, like I think it mentioned it. Um, but there's different languages, different jargon that people use to put into words how individuals in societies advance. Um, and one of so in the Foundations of Archdisciplinarity book, in the first half of it, it's divided into scopes of inquiry, scales of theory, and then like stages of social development. Um, and so I've talked a little bit about like scopes of inquiry, with the disciplinary language. And we can also talk about like scales of theory that follow along with those different scopes of inquiry. And I'll just kind of run through them quick, which is that there's like theories, and then there's meta theories, which are theories about other theories. And then there's integrative or unification meta theories. And those are when we get to the transdisciplinary scope. And then there's arch theories, and then the arch theories are associated with that arch disciplinary scope. Similarly, there's a similar approximation with stages of individual and sociocultural development. And the way it goes is, different people divide it up in different ways, and I think that all those ways have different validity. The way that we do it in the book is basically to say that there's pre-modern, modern, postmodern, meta-modern, and then arch-modern. So pre-modern basically is like very traditional religiosity approaches. So people's sensibility about the world is determined by their religious beliefs. So they don't need to have like any evidence per se for a belief. They just have their faith, and then they usually draw their truths from whatever their holy text is, or whatever their religious practices are. With modernity, this introduces like empiricism. So people get to a point where they say, okay, so our religious way of making sense of things, that's all fine and good. But there are some things about the natural world that it isn't showing us. Like it doesn't show us a methodology for how to know that. And in order for us to enrich our lives and understand the world around us better, there are other things that we can learn. And then we can follow a particular procedure for how to know about that world and how to verify that things are true. So I can follow a method, and then I can keep track of everything as I like what my original idea was, like my hypothesis, and then I can run through a sequence of actions and get an outcome and record that, and I can give it to other people, and then they can do the same thing themselves, see if they get the same outcome. And then if we have differences, then we can have a conversation about it. So this is the basis of science. Like modernity is about primarily about science and rationality. So from modernity comes postmodernity, because what happens is that there are actually different methodologies that we can follow. And when we follow those different methodologies, we arrive at different kinds of conclusions. So postmodernists have a sort of a relativism perspective, which says, well, you follow your methodology, I follow mine, we come to different conclusions, but how do we decide on like who's actually right? Because sometimes we come to very opposite conclusions. And so, there's this notion of like structuralism, that everything is constructed, and even our ideas about how we form methodologies are constructed. And then it sort of like reaches a ceiling where everything is just relative, and, anyone can be and do anything that they want. Nobody can really argue them for their way of thinking and doing, because there's no basis to make have a consensus. So with what happens with metamodern sensibilities basically says, well, wait a minute, there's all these different ways of knowing and doing, but we can actually fit them together. We can actually systematize them. And then it turns out that they actually all do fit together, and they represent different ways of being a person. And then we can carry forward some of the pre-modern stuff, some of the modern stuff, and some of the postmodern stuff. And when we combine that all together, we get a new kind of a sensibility that understands that people are actually going through processes. Now we have several different, individual and social development stages that we can reflect on. And so we can get a trajectory of like where we came from and where we're going. So how this answers the question of arch modernism, first I would say that arch disciplinarity is very new. So there have been people who have been doing arch disciplinary practice without there yet being a term and definition for it. And even now, like in our organization and in, for example, the Institute of Applied Metatheory, I would say they're doing like arch disciplinary stuff. But we don't have a lot of examples to draw on to say a whole lot about what it is, because it's basically like me and people that I know talking about ourselves. There's not, the group of people who are doing it all kind of know each other in most cases. So there isn't sort of like an objective, reflective point that we can look at to assess. And then therefore it becomes sort of like, it can be a little bit biased, right? Because then, we're saying things about our own selves and observations we're making on our own. And then we haven't yet gotten to the point where you can sort of like verify it, like from other perspectives, people developing other frameworks in the same space for making sense of what's going on to get that comparative analysis. But I would say that if we look at like the historical like periods in what happens is that there's this similar repetition of this pattern. So like earlier on, like I was talking about universal computability, where you have like entities, relationships, and systems. So like a system then becomes a new entity, and then the entity has relationships with other entities, and then the relationships between them becomes a system, and that becomes a new entity. So we could think about that like in terms of the behavioral complexity of development, where when we're going from one stage to the next, we're following this procedure and becoming more complex in our thinking. And so, like going to like the post-modernity thing, for example. So you get all these different ways of being and doing in the world. So that would be the entities. But then you realize that they can all be related to each other. And then you can systematize it and you get to the meta-modern. So we could say something similar going from the meta-modern to the arch-modern. So you have different versions of meta-modernism. So like some people think about it as like artistic and cultural. Other people think about it in the context of like spirituality. Other people think about it in the context of like psychology. Other people are more social studies oriented in terms of how they're making sense of it. So the arch modern thing says, okay, well then now let's look across all these different ways that people take approaches, that the different kinds of sensibilities people have in the way that they're experiencing the world from these different meta-modern perspectives, and then let's relate them to each other, and then let's systematize them together to find what they share in common. In the same way that we would say, well, there's these big picture theory of everything frameworks. Let's look across each of these and relate them, and then systematize to see what they all share in common. So I think we're sort of like in a transitional process. But if I were to make like a guess, and it's only a guess, it would, and a lot of this is written in the Foundations book, which is that I think a lot of it has to do with people breaking down the boundaries between their theory of everything approaches that they have. So like there's this situation historically where people who, they put their blood, sweat, and tears into building a framework that can unify everything humanity understands, whether that's in a specific domain or to cross domains. And then all of a sudden you get other people who also put their blood, sweat, and tears. And I think that it can feel a little bit competitive between people because they're trying to create an audience, but then there's other people who are trying to create their own audiences. So I think I think arch modernism would be like this sort of breakthrough, like something that we've done in the organization, something I see in the Institute of Applied Metatheory doing. There's this sort of like breaking through to say, okay, so we all have like our theory of everything frameworks. We should be working together instead of competing for audiences, right? Like we should be looking for what we share in common. And then looking about how we can apply our commonality to solving real world problems instead of having endless armchair debates, arguing about like whose framework is right and wrong, and um, you know, the causality of one error or another. Like I think no matter how many stacks of complexity a person goes, we're always going to have errors. We're always going to make mistakes. I think from what I observe, people usually place emphasis on what is in common across the frameworks, and then build mutuality on those. And then after mutuality is established, then you can have those conversations, because now you've earned the right to have the more difficult conversations, and people know that the person who's challenging them means well, right? They're not just trying to replace their framework with another. They're trying to help update the framework so it can be the best framework that it can be.
Yeah, there's this real sense of this yes and, right? Like it's another thing that I've discovered that we have in common is that we're both part of Kurt Mungel's Theories of Everything Discord server, where there's a similar project to discover the requirements of a theory of everything. And I know that's a big part of your work as well, right? The arches are these like commonalities between theories of everything.
Yeah. So one of the chapters in the book on archdisciplinary research actually gives an outline of some of the properties that would constitute a theory of everything. And I'm just kind of saying off the top. I don't have the best memory. I'll just say off the top of my head from what I recall. In order for something to be considered a theory of everything, it has to, so actually breaks down into like, I would say like two different categories. So you have theories of everything that are domain specific, and then there are theories of everything that are cross domain. So theories of everything that are domain specific would be like Hawking's theory of everything of material reality, right? So he's trying to explain how it all works together. An example of like in the domain of life would be like Miller's living systems. So he's aggregated all the paradigms, and then he's fit them all together into all the building blocks of life and like how it all relates to each other. But there's also like theories of everything that are cross domain, and then they basically take everything we know about each of these, each of the domains, however they divide it up, and then they try and fit them all together into some sort of coherent framework. So I would say that it has to do with like integrating everything within a given scope, in the context of that, whatever their scope is. So like I would say like for the two examples I gave, for domain specific, I would generally classify them as like meta-theoretical. Like they're unifications, but they're not at the same scope and scale as something like integral theory or like Henrique's unified theory of knowledge, right? Where he accounts for all of the domains and he describes a multiplicity of paradigms and how they can be systematized to make sense of what's going on in each domain, and then relates across the domains. So another way of dividing it up would be to say that they have to, before I was talking about architectures and processes, so one of the arches is called integrative levels. And that means that in general, what we found for theories of everything is that they almost always have some account of building blocks of nature. So whether that's in one domain or it's across domains, or they're taking the domains themselves and putting them into levels. And then each one has its sort of like sub-levels. So that generally falls into like two categories, where there's like theories of everything that are architectural, ontological, and structural, like defining what exists in the universe. And then there's process models. And then those describe how things happen, the way that things transform from one thing into another across domains. So theories of everything usually will fit into one of those two categories. Another thing that I would make a distinction about with theories of everything is the magnitude of behavioral complexity that a person has in constructing their framework. So just thinking what framework I would want to use to put this in context. Well, I'll just say it like this. So there's a difference between having a theory of everything that treats universal classes as generalizations, as opposed to a framework that fully accounts for the paradigms, can describe their principles and how they apply to abstract systems about concrete real world things. So historically, people would have theories of everything, like, for example, like in Hermetic alchemy, they would draw these elaborate diagrams, and then they would have like these different classes of reality. But they wouldn't give high level specificity about the interiority of the mechanisms of what's going on, right? So another distinction I would make is the magnitude of behavioral complexity a person is using to construct the framework. Um, and then of course I would also include like calculatory. So there are fewer cases where people have a theory of everything that accounts for architectures and processes both, and shows how they are interrelated to calculate all the complexities that exist in that given domain or across domains. And so in general, they'll fall into one of those categories.
Another way that I've heard those categories described before is a grand unification theory, the specifics around physics and the missing elements of physical theories. And they're usually kind of maybe the domain specific theories you're talking about. And a theory that can describe both the interface between the fundamental stuff of existence, whether that's framed as in the theory, and the unfolding of that into everyday world, and how it might emerge as political systems or even psychology or minds. Those kind of theories feel a lot more rare in that they cover both the scope of the grand unification theory and the second kind of theory that you mentioned. And then there's also another kind of framing that I like, where we've got the logos and the mythos of the theory. The kind of the alchemist's exploration of the theory is kind of like this mythos. It's pointing to something symbolically, and there's a kind of necessity of that, in that it's the way that we relate to the information on a personal experiential level. And then there's the logos, which is the kind of more specific telling of the dynamics and the interplay between whatever the framework is telling. So yeah, kind of like those framings as well.
Yeah, I like that. And the sort of natural inclination of my brain is to say, so like each one of those lenses reveals a very valuable rendition of reality. But then we can also relate them to each other, and we can systematize them, and then we get a more robust, penetrating understanding. And I would also say that those things you're talking about, I think they also relate to different orientations for how we use our brains, right? So like if we're talking about logos, could we correspond that with like prefrontal cortex, like logical related stuff, or like eros we could associate with like affect, what is it, like the amygdala, like the affect, emotional, like sensory, sort of experience.